Rancher sat alone with a hungry baby. The cry of the child split the silence of the prairie cabin, sharp and endless, echoing through rooms that only weeks ago had carried the warmth of a woman's laughter. Now those walls knew only grief. Daniel Carter, a man whose hands had tamed wild horses and split cedar for fences, found himself powerless before a swaddled infant whose tiny fists beat the air in desperate hunger. His wife, Anna, had been buried on a hill just beyond the cottonwoods, where the spring grass was greening. She had slipped away after bringing their son into the world, one life ending as another began. Daniel had dug the grave himself, each stroke of the spade a wound deeper than the last. He was a man carved from endurance, but no strength could soothe a starving baby whose mother's milk was gone forever. Days blurred into nights. He tried cow's milk, watered down and warmed, but the child gagged, cried harder, and grew weaker. The ranch was no place for an infant without a mother, yet Daniel could not bring himself to send the boy away. His heart clung to the child as the last fragment of Anna, the last proof that she had ever loved him. But as the baby's cries grew thinner, ragged with exhaustion, Daniel's despair deepened. He paced the cabin floorboards until they groaned beneath his boots. He prayed, though prayer had long been a language foreign to him. He held the boy against his chest and whispered Anna's name until his voice broke. And then, on the fourth night, as the wind carried the scent of rain over the plains, a knock came at the door. It was not loud, not hurried, just steady, as though the knocker knew desperation lay on the other side. Daniel froze, the baby pressed against his shoulder, both of them startled into silence. Visitors rarely came this far. No one should have been out on the prairie after dark. He opened the door, and there she stood, a woman, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill, her face pale from travel. She carried nothing but a small satchel, her dark hair damp with the mist of the coming storm. Yet it was not her weariness that caught Daniel's eye. It was the way she looked at the child in his arms, with a mix of sorrow and certainty. "I heard," she said softly, her voice trembling yet resolute. "I heard you lost your wife. And the baby needs feeding." Daniel stared, words caught in his throat. Her name was Margaret Hayes, a widow from the settlement across the river. Months ago, she too had known loss. Her own infant had not survived the fever that swept the valley. But her body still carried the burden of a mother's gift. And when whispers reached her of a rancher alone with a child who would not last much longer, she could not turn away. Daniel's pride bristled. How could he, who had weathered storms and droughts, depend on the charity of a stranger? Yet as the baby whimpered weakly in his arms, pride shrank before desperation. Margaret stepped into the cabin without another word. She sat by the hearth, loosened her shawl, and cradled the infant with a tenderness Daniel could scarcely bear to watch. The baby latched and drank greedily, the silence broken only by the small sounds of life returning to him. For the first time in days, Daniel's shoulders eased. His breath came ragged, and before he could stop himself, tears cut through the dust on his cheeks. The fire popped in the hearth, rain whispered against the roof, and in that fragile moment, something shifted in the cabin. Grief still lingered heavy in the air, but alongside it flickered the faintest spark of hope. Daniel did not speak, nor did Margaret ask for thanks. The baby slept at last, his face softened into peace. Outside, the storm passed, leaving the land hushed and waiting, and so it was that two broken souls found themselves under one roof, bound not by choice, but by need. Neither knew what would come of it. Neither dared imagine. But in that night's quiet, the first thread of a story began to weave, a story of loss, of healing, and of a love that neither had gone looking for. Morning came slowly to the Carter ranch, the pale light spilling over the plains, washing the cabin in a quiet glow. Daniel had not slept. He sat in his chair by the hearth, his son nestled peacefully in Margaret's arms. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of strength returning, and for the first time since Anna's passing, Daniel felt the iron grip of dread loosen in his chest. Margaret stirred, her shawl slipping from her shoulder as she shifted the baby against her. Her face looked tired, yet there was something soft in her expression, a quiet peace that only a mother who had once known loss could wear. Daniel watched her, feeling both gratitude and unease twist together inside him. He owed her his son's life, but the thought of another woman's hands where Anna's should have been filled him with guilt. The ranch demanded attention, as it always did, grief or no. Horses needed feeding, fences repairing, and calves had wandered too far in the night. Daniel pulled on his boots, but before he stepped outside, Margaret's voice stopped him. "Leave him with me," she said gently. "He'll rest easier in arms than alone in a cradle." Her words, so practical and steady, caught him off guard. He nodded, unable to reply, and left the cabin with a heaviness that felt both like burden and relief. Out on the plains, the world was unchanging. The wind combed through the tall grass, and the lowing of cattle rolled over the distance. Yet for Daniel, everything was different. Each swing of the hammer, each coil of rope, carried a thought of the child within and the woman who now held him. Days stretched into weeks. Margaret stayed. She told herself it was only until the baby no longer needed her. But as the child grew stronger, she found herself lingering longer by the fire, helping with small tasks, kneading bread, mending torn shirts, sweeping out the dust. Daniel did not ask her to remain, but neither did he ask her to leave. Their silences became a language of their own, a truce of shared grief and reluctant companionship. At night, when the baby slept between them, Margaret sometimes hummed lullabies Daniel did not know. The soft melodies wound through the cabin like threads of another life, a life gentler and fuller than the one he had come to accept. He would lie awake, staring at the beams above, his heart aching with the ghost of Anna and the strange new presence of Margaret. Yet with hope came fear. The town began to whisper. Folks at the trading post spoke of the widow Hayes staying under Carter's roof, of how quickly she had stepped into a dead woman's place. Daniel heard the talk when he rode in for supplies, saw the way men tipped their hats with forced courtesy, and women pressed lips tight against judgment. He said nothing, but the words weighed on him. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he found Margaret on the porch rocking the baby. The wind lifted strands of her hair, and her gaze was lost in the fading light. "They'll never understand, will they?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Daniel hesitated. "People will always talk. And you?" Her voice trembled. "Do you understand?" He did not answer. He wanted to say yes, that he understood she had saved them both, that her presence had drawn him back from the edge of despair. But the words tangled with guilt, with the memory of Anna's laughter still echoing in the rooms of the house. Instead, he stepped down into the yard, unable to meet her eyes. That night, sleep would not come. He listened to the soft breaths of his son, to Margaret's steady hum, and to the storm building in his own heart. He was caught between two worlds, the love he had lost and the love he dared not claim. But the prairie had its own way of deciding fates, and soon it would test them both in ways neither could have foreseen. The storm came hard and fast across the plains, a wall of black clouds rolling in like cavalry at full charge. Daniel had seen tempests before, but this one carried a weight that made his bones ache. By dusk, the wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, rattling the shutters like the fists of ghosts. Inside, Margaret clutched the baby close as the fire snapped and guttered. Daniel moved with purpose, securing windows, driving iron hooks into the doors. Each gust shook the cabin, reminding him of how fragile their refuge truly was. When the worst of the storm broke, the roof groaned beneath sheets of rain. Lightning tore across the sky, followed by thunder that shook the very floorboards. Then came the sound Daniel dreaded most, the cry of cattle scattered, fences breaking under the fury of wind. He grabbed his hat and coat. "They'll be lost if I don't drive them back in," he shouted above the roar. Margaret's eyes widened. "You can't go out in that?" "The boy, he needs you here." But Daniel was already at the door, torn between duty to his herd and the fragile peace inside. His wife had once begged him to choose family over cattle. He hadn't listened then. Would he repeat the mistake? A smaller cry pierced the storm, the baby, frightened, hungry, inconsolable. Margaret rocked him, her own face pale with fear. And in that moment, Daniel saw the truth. He could replace cattle, rebuild fences, but if he lost the boy, or the woman who had brought him back to life, he would be truly empty. He closed the door, hands trembling, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. All through the night, they rode the storm together. Daniel fed the fire while Margaret soothed the child, their shoulders brushing in the cramped space, the air heavy with unspoken words. When the wind finally stilled and dawn cracked pale over the drenched earth, silence fell. The ranch was battered, but still standing. Exhaustion weighed on them both. Margaret sank into a chair, the baby asleep against her breast. Daniel stood watching her, his heart tight with something he had fought too long to admit. "You've given him life," he said at last, his voice raw. "And you've given me more than I deserve." Margaret looked up, startled by the naked truth in his words. Her eyes shimmered with something between hope and fear. "I never wanted to take her place," she whispered. "I only wanted to help." Daniel's chest ached. "You haven't taken her place. You've given us another chance. And maybe that's what Anna would have wanted." The words cracked open something inside him. Grief poured out, but with it came release. He crossed the room, kneeling before Margaret, his rough hand brushing the baby's tiny fingers. Together, they looked at the child, then at each other, as if seeing not just what had been lost, but what might yet be found. Outside, the prairie gleamed under the new sun. Water sparkled on every blade of grass, the land reborn in the wake of ruin. Inside the cabin, a different kind of dawn was breaking, one stitched together not from perfection, but from survival, sorrow, and the courage to love again. Daniel took Margaret's hand. It was calloused like his own, marked by work and loss, but warm, steady, alive. For the first time since Anna's death, he felt the cabin breathe again, not with absence but with possibility. The baby stirred, whimpering softly, and both of them leaned close. Their son, his son, their son, would grow in a home shaped by two hearts that had been broken and then mended together. And so the rancher was no longer alone. What began with grief and a knock at the door had become a story of love's quiet return, as unexpected and fierce as any storm across the open plains.